I was in Madagascar. I knew this
How did your story start?
so we ended up selling to them before we even raised like a proper pre-seed round.
That's Puja Balachander. She's the exited founder of Devi, and she's now building Upgreen while also being the director of venture at Carbon 13.
And we had like more than 700 users like in our first day, and then like it just like really ballooned, and it was a horrible product, honestly.
But through constant iteration, they took off.
But it got to the point that basically we had around 20,000 paying users, and like our 30-day retention was like 60% or something. It was like really high.
But building it to where they wanted wasn't easy.
I was incredibly burnt out and hadn't basically taken a salary in 3 years.
An early acquisition meant she could make the impact from the original idea while also change her path.
I did like 5 Accelerator. That was the most accelerated startup. Do like the sort of quasi-investing work.
She's helped dozens of founders now at Carbon 13, and those companies are making a real difference. And she's got the founder bug herself still, and through Upgreen, is planning to revolutionize financing for retrofitting buildings.
We're working with like 50 to 60 banks, and therefore we have, 50,000 buildings that we're actually doing for your. Growing up, I wanted to be a diplomat. I was super involved in Model United Nations. I thought I wanted to work for the UN. I was like one of these nerds that, every weekend, I don't know if you've ever watched Never Have I Ever on Netflix, but when they are in Model United Nations and they go to these different universities every weekend and they represent these different countries and you have to write a position paper and learn about all these different issues, I absolutely loved it. And so because I loved Model United Nations so much and I was the president of that in high school, I was like, okay, I must need to be a diplomat now. So I wanted to do something in the Foreign Service, either be a Foreign Service officer in the US or work in international development or for an NGO or something along these lines. And so I went to DC for college and studied international studies.
So obviously people listening and they realize your accent isn't from here. So where did you grow up before you went to DC?
Yeah, I grew up in California in the Silicon Valley, and I thoroughly felt like tech was not for me. It was not, I was just out of place, and I was actually a diplomat, and I wanted to do foreign service. And I was one of these like 12-year-olds with a subscription to Foreign Policy magazine and The Economist. It was like super lame. But anyway, I was super into that, felt really out of place, and then moved to DC for college. So, but yeah, basically grew up in the US.
And then, okay, so you're not a diplomat now, as far as I know.
No.
What made you change from that path at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, when I went to college and I was studying international studies and I actually got exposed to that whole sector, what I realized was that they were talking about a bunch of stuff, and it was really interesting, intellectually stimulating stuff, but it was almost like real life Model United Nations. Like as little as they got done there was how much was actually getting done in real life. And so I got much more interested in the international development space and the policy space. And so but which is more connected to actually doing things and having action, right? So I, right after college, joined the Obama administration and was working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so, and it was totally by accident, like one of my former internship supervisors, like joined that office and asked if I wanted to come in as an admin.
What year is this, if you don't give mind?
No, it's all good. I'm fine to age myself. I think this was 2015.
So it's the second.
Yes, exactly. It was the last 2 years of his administration. So basically joined this completely by luck through a former internship supervisor and totally fell back into tech. Like it was crazy. I went all the way to the East Coast. I was in India. I was doing all this stuff. I really wanted to work in international development. I really thought I was going to work for USAID or the State Department or move abroad or do something. And I ended up at the Office of Science and Technology Policy working on quite domestic policy issues. But it was actually super interesting because we were basically working with bringing in private sector technologists and entrepreneurs often into government to actually do these sort of like internal transformation projects. So one of my projects was at the VA on reducing the time it takes for veterans to get benefits. Another project was at the Department of Health and Human Services around supporting child welfare agencies at the state and local level to use technology much more effectively because there was a lot of just inefficiency that was happening with case management systems. We worked on improving the U.S. Department of Agriculture's guidance to the state and local level around free school lunch programs. So super broad-based, but all of it was sort of using digital as almost like a Trojan horse for changing bigger things in government. And I really kind of stayed in that space for a while. I then moved to the World Bank, where I was in Madagascar and working with the Office of National Nutrition or National Nutrition Office on reducing child stunting, but still using kind of similar tools, basically some sort of like innovation consulting, but there. And then moved into the city of Austin, where I was doing very similar things, but at a local level. And so I spent a long time actually in the public sector, or like quasi public sector, if you count the World Bank as that. So while I wasn't sort of a diplomat, I kind of did diplomat-y things, but maybe perhaps more action-oriented versions of those things. So I like to think I still kind of followed through on that in a small way. But what I did find really disillusioning about that was that every 4 years or every time my work would just be completely undone.
Yeah.
So obviously after the Obama administration felt like we had done so much good work, Trump administration came in, literally none of the things I worked on exist anymore. Same thing with the World Bank when I was leaving Madagascar, or not leaving, I wasn't even actually planning on leaving. There was a coup overnight, a bloodless coup, but like every ministry head was replaced. And so our project just sort of stalled in the water after doing it for, a year and a half. And then similarly in the city of Austin, actually, that didn't happen. I think at the local level, there's potentially a lot more resilience. But by then I had gotten into Oxford for the MBA program, which I had applied to earlier. And so I decided I wanted to take a stab at that and sort of leave government after having done that for the first chunk of my career.
So I'm going to come back towards the end about, obviously now, I was at the GovTech conference the other day, and hearing politicians talk about tech is very interesting.
And I roll.
And if they're listening, I wasn't eye rolling. But it's very interesting to see how they're trying to frame it, because I think one of the big challenges they had a lot of time is that, or what people bring up is that it's all well and good to announce, okay, we're going to go 1 billion to quantum. What are you going to do? And just, it was like...
You mean investments in tech in the ecosystem?
So like putting their resource, okay, we're going to spend this much in this area, or we're going to put more programs to supporting entrepreneurs. But then it kind of comes from a top-down level rather than working out, okay, we're doing these pilots and they're working well. How do we make them bigger? Or those kind of things. So we'll come back to politics towards the end if you've got time. I don't want to show you down the rabbit hole with you. Yeah.
Happy to. I think a lot of what we were working on was actually making it so that you are basically applying almost like a product approach to making a lot of those investments.
And obviously going to Oxford, so obviously you got the brand name of Oxford, but what made you decide to even do an MBA in the first place? What made you decide that's the next step for you in your career?
Honestly, it was very random. I was in Madagascar. I knew this
how all stories start. Yeah. So back to that car.
One does. Yeah. As it did. So there was this coup, but literally I hadn't actually planned to come back to the States. But now it seemed like my contract was not going to get renewed because basically the environment, it wasn't clear that our project would even continue anymore. And so I was literally looking at, okay, what do I want to do next? And I had I've had a few different hypotheses in a very typical sort of producty way. And I got targeted by an ad for a scholarship at the MBA, for the Oxford MBA on LinkedIn or something. So I was like, well, if I could do an MBA for free, sure. And
just get that scholarship.
I did not. I did not end up getting it for free, unfortunately. But, it was what basically motivated me to apply. And the fact that it was more impact focused was something that I was more interested in. Because the other thing is that I have spent my entire career in government. So I was like, okay, maybe I want to try private sector.
Was it a good sliding door moment where you're happy that you went and the experience was...
Yeah, oh my God, my life would not be the same. I think, London is my home now. I built my company. Would have never met my co-founders if I hadn't gone to Oxford.
So you said you met your co-founders in Oxford as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us that story and where the idea came from?
Yeah. So in our first week during Welcome Week, everyone is hyper networking. I don't know if you've ever been in an MBA program. Yeah, but it's walking resumes, walking egotistical resumes. We are all like that.
There's been influencer events where somebody would be like, hi, I'm this person. I've got this many followers on TikTok. Like, don't care. Cool.
It was the MBA version of that. And I kind of found this woman who was just super different than everyone else. She was her name is Laura. She was one of the other MBA cohort members. She had been a preschool teacher in DC before coming to the MBA. And I think me and her bonded because both of us had reasonably atypical paths to get into the MBA program. I think she being a preschool teacher, me having just come from Madagascar in the city of Austin or whatever, doing some design and innovation work. And she had this really inspirational vision, honestly, where she said that she had been a teacher, she had seen these gaps in early childhood education, and more importantly, sort of in early childhood development in general, where like in her classroom, she's able to do so much to make sure that every child, gets that strong start in life. But, that's not an equally accessible resource, despite all of the research that shows that investments in early childhood education and development have insane ROI over their lifetime. So she wanted to do something start a social enterprise in early childhood development. And I was like, okay, that's super interesting. My background is in product and design, so I can help you with going from I want to do something in this space to, okay, this is the thing that would actually make the most impact, and here's how we're going to build it. And so I just got sucked in. She was just like a really inspirational person, and I thought that her expertise was really valuable. And we just started doing the user research right away. And speaking to a lot of parents, both in our cohorts and outside of it, policymakers, other innovators. I mean, the MBA is obviously also designed to do that, right? Like it gives you really a lot of the structure to kind of explore some of those ideas. Pretty soon, I was just completely sucked in to the point that eventually, and I think I really, really enjoyed the entrepreneurial journey too. I didn't really come in with the intention of doing that at all. I thought probably I would go back abroad and still work in international development, but maybe do so from like a private sector perspective or something like that. But I ended up just really enjoying it. I loved the user research. And, my background was in research and product management and design. And it just felt like the purest version of that, where there's just no other stakeholders. It's literally you're just designing the product that will be the stickiest, most delightful experience that actually solves your user's problem in a vacuum at first, where like there's no investors, there's no business model, like nothing. You're just having that. I found that so energizing to start with. And then once we started pitching and actually working, like actually doing the commercial side too, and having to figure out all of those things, I just found it to be such a stimulating challenge.
Was this like while you were still on your MBA?
Yeah, this was during the MBA. This was during it. We had a little bit of like pre-seed, not even pre-seed really, accelerator funding by the time we came out. And so we both decided to go full time. And, but at the same time that I was realizing, the whole entrepreneurial journey was really energizing for me, it was really draining for Laura, to say the least. So ironically, she was the one who had actually wanted to start out doing a social enterprise. So she ended up stepping away. I ended up actually as a solo founder after that point. And yeah, pretty much made every mistake in the book afterwards. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a really wholesome start. We're still like really good friends, and she stepped away at the time that was right for her.
I guess that's one of the interesting things because, as you said, where so much of the excitement of being right, especially was she a first time founder,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And when things start changing, and it's let's say at the beginning, the vacuum is pure, right? When you're just working on an idea, but then once other stakeholders come in, there's all these different pressure from all these different places, and then the pressures on the founding team change, right? And how did that conversation go? Or how did you manage to navigate that? Because I'm sure there's some people listening right now thinking, maybe this co-founding team isn't going to work out, but I feel too guilty to walk away, or what about if I say I don't want to do it anymore, and then the other person feels like they're going to blame
Left
me?
in the lurch. Yeah. I mean, I know that, first of all, this was not at all a smooth task, like it was very much, who knows how much Laura agonized before she told me that was the case. I mean, she was literally getting ulcers from stress. Like, I think it was actually, physically not healthy for her to continue doing this. And so, and of course I noticed that she was getting really stressed. I noticed that because at first actually she was the CEO, and I was more like a chief product person. So I think one is like knowing yourself, knowing the other person, being really open and honest about those conversations. So now with my co-founder, who like ended up being my co-founder on the last startup as well, like after some time, after I spent some time with this as a solo founder and made some of the wrong decisions, I made a right decision. And then I had a new co-founder who was great. But because I had gone through that sort of like stressful process, not just with Laura, but with a couple other co-founders, ex-co-founders now that I went through that journey with, I really learned to basically just have these really open and honest conversations quite often. So now, like, me and my co-founder have this thing called like a coffee chat, and we know that if we ask for a coffee chat, we need to like drop a truth bomb, where it's like, for example, like he was
we need to have a chat. I was like, oh.
Exactly. It's like, ooh, like we might be breaking up.
Yeah.
But it's one of those where it's like most of the time it's not we're breaking up. It's, something needs to change. And that's usually a positive thing. And then I think even if it is, okay, maybe now we're breaking up, we both know that we have each other's back, that like we would never just like disappear tomorrow. It would be like a way of like managing a transition as well.
Hello. Quick interruption to let you know a bit more about Bay HQ. We're the community for high growth Asian heritage entrepreneurs, operators, and investors in the UK. You can join us totally free at thebayhq.com/join. There you'll get our CEO structure in your inbox every week, which is content, events, and opportunities. You can also get access to our free Startup Fundamentals course by joining. Let's get back to the show. And so with Devi, right, so once you took over as CEO, and like you said, you were working out the business model, trying to work out these different things. What was it, where did it get to before you went into acquisition afterwards? But what was it that you figured out, and how were you able to build a product that people loved?
So on the product side, Laura is a teacher. Her specialty is she will watch children play in her classroom, and she will assess their developmental level and then plan activities that will move them up. So whether that's social emotionally in terms of their just fine motor skills, it could also be in terms of their executive function, like it doesn't matter, but she will basically assess what level they're at and then plan an activity that moves them to the next stage. And so what we thought was, okay, what if we just digitize that? Like we use AI and computer vision to basically analyze children playing, identify like their developmental markers, and like base that against a database of these activities that we could pursue.
There's also AI before it was cool as well, right?
That's actually true. Like towards the end, we were doing like natural language. It was like basically a chatbot, but it was like we were using natural language to interact. The entire thing was basically like a chat interface. So we were doing LLM.
So ChatGPT basically just copied you.
Yeah, literally. Exactly. But, obviously, if we had ChatGPT at the time, we would have been wildly more successful. But even at the very beginning, we were using like computer vision, trying to identify those kind of markers. Honestly, one is that technically that's crazy hard because obviously children move in so many different ways. Like, can you really tell? Like, it really does take like a human, I think, at the end of the day to be able to tell, is a child feeling sad? Are they feeling upset? What could actually be how are they dealing with conflict? These sort of things. And the younger that a child gets, the more in some ways, the less subtle it becomes because it's like just a cry or not, but also potentially the more subtle it becomes because actually, you have to sort of learn the way they specifically communicate those things. So anyway, one was that was really technically difficult, but more importantly, we didn't even attempt the technology first. We just did a WhatsApp thing where we recruited a bunch of parents in our MBA cohort and got them to just take pictures of their kids, send it to Laura. Laura would identify them manually and then give them some activities to do. And because we were like, okay, this is exactly what the actual tool would do. Let's just test it like completely manually. And what we found was that the parents would be like, this is super interesting. And then text her in the middle of the night being like, hey, my kid isn't sleeping. What do I do? Because they knew they had like an expert on speed dial basically. And so suddenly that was the value proposition. Like really, like the games were nice to have. This was the like need to have, the real pain point. So we were like, okay, that's what we should lean in on. So we were like, okay, how do we make this sort of expert level coaching more accessible? And then we worked with a local organization in Oxfordshire that worked with young parents. And we like offered that as a service to them. So they were our pilot organization basically. So they got like the 10 parents signed up or something. And then we started offering that coaching from Laura. And then people started actually like divulging quite difficult things. Like it really became clear that it wasn't just about whatever the children were doing and questions they had. It became about like really parent mental health too, about how stressed they were and how difficult life was. And, they were navigating issues with their relationships and like all kinds of things. And so we realized it actually needed to encompass both the parent kind of well-being experience as well as the children's, not just Q&A, but also activities and all of these other things. And then we were like, also, it's not scalable. Like Laura isn't scalable. So we need to start actually figuring out how we do this. Like we scale up this coaching. So we started to actually try and script it. So then we tried to take everyone through like a very similar scripting process, and we take them through like activities. And I don't know, there's like these softwares you can use to basically like program a decision tree type chatbot. So we tried using that to like do the first versions of it. The first ones were complete shit. And like over time though, it got stickier. Basically people were like, our metric at the time were people like making it through 7 days of like chatting with Debbie every day, basically. And once we got to that point, then we were like, okay, it's worth actually even productizing this. And then we made it into like an app that actually like the release of our beta coincided with the lockdown. So it was literally like the week that it happened, and suddenly all these parents were trapped at home with their young children that they were like not expecting to have to spend this much time with, really. And so, the app, which I had literally said, don't even bother with putting it on test flight and stuff. Like, let's just put it on the app store. No one's going to find it anyway. Like people will just, only the people we told to find it will find it anyway to be our initial beta testers. But it literally got put on a couple of these like Google Docs that the moms were sending out as like resources for for parents stuck during lockdown. And we had like more than 700 users like in our first day. And then like it just like really, really ballooned. And it was a horrible product. Honestly, it just had like the minimum functionality. Like there was no way someone was going to stay on there for longer than like a week at most. And it was but it ended up being like such good data because obviously so far we had only really gotten like quite anecdotal data from small sets of parents. This time we had like hundreds of parents using it in this tiny amount of time. And we had like basically this little section that just had the different topics and stuff that they could work on. So it was like social and emotional development, behavioral issues, like fine motor skills, parent well-being, whatever. There were like some segments, some topics. And like some wild number, like 80% of people that came went straight to the behavioral issues. And maybe it was because obviously they were in lockdown and kids were having more behavioral issues, of course, as a result. But it was just really obvious like where the need actually was. And so then we were like, okay, let's drill down deeper into that. Anyway, I'm going to skip a bunch of this product stuff because it's interesting, but it was like very incremental in that way. Eventually, what we came up with was like, then we got to a reasonably sticky point. Then we were like, okay, we actually need to monetize this. And then we realized
So at this point, it's a completely free app.
Completely free because we were just like I said, purists. We were really just trying to figure out like, what is the thing that would be sticky? What is the thing that people really want? What's actually going to solve their problem? And we had this, of course, when we pitched investors, we were like, oh, it'll be freemium, whatever. But actually then once we tried to monetize it, one idea we had was monetizing it via early childhood education. So basically like daycare centers would pay for it for their parents. Basically what we found was it was like not possible. And then we decided through healthcare was actually the best way to do it because actually this was sort of like health adjacent, I guess, like in a more holistic way in terms of supporting new parents. But what we knew was that we would need like way better data on our impact in order to ever be, procured by a healthcare system. But it also came in at the time that I had another new co-founder, not the technical one, but she was a child psychologist. And she was a professor of child psychology. So we started just digitizing, basically putting our content, but into these sort of psychological frameworks that she had already, like therapeutic frameworks that they used. And so we could basically call it almost digitizing child psychology and making it accessible to parents. And so then we had like the excuse to be able to actually charge people for it. And then we also made like a tiered system. So we had like a social support element, and then we had like experts in the loop as well. So like it was a long journey in terms of like both figuring out the product, also figuring out the business model. Most of that time we were not paying ourselves or like paying ourselves extremely little. But it got to the point that basically we had around 20,000 paying users, and like our 30-day retention was like 60% or something. It was like really high. So it was a sticky product, and it was like people were paying for it, and it was, the unit economics were not profitable at the time, of course, but they were paying the amount that should become profitable at scale, right? So, and then basically we got offered to be. By this point, I will say I was incredibly burnt out and hadn't basically taken a salary in 3 years, and so we got this offer basically to integrate with this child welfare, with this nonprofit actually that sold software into state and local child welfare agencies. And though it would have never been my first choice to sell at the time, I think both because of like my mental health, but also the fact that they just offered so much more impact and scale. I think like it would literally go from being a sort of yummy mummy app for UK moms to being a prescribed by social workers for the state of California, the state of Georgia, the state of Massachusetts. Like the scale of impact, also the profile of person we would even be serving would just be so much more aligned to the reason we started the company.
Yeah.
That like it just felt like almost a no-brainer that this was the way that we wanted to go. So we ended up selling to them before we even raised like a proper pre-seed round. So I think it was definitely a learning experience in every way. Probably not like super lucrative financially for me or anything like that, or any of our early investors, like, nothing like that. But in terms of the impact and scale, it was definitely right. And I think, now it still exists, and that's really exciting.
So you mentioned there about that choir, and like, thanks for sharing the journey about the different iterations too. But once you got like that acquisition there, and they brought on your software, and they brought on that, made a bigger impact, did you stay on at the company, or how was that transition? Like,
Yeah. So I was there for like 18 months. I was brought in as basically their director of product. So it was not just this product basically that I was working on. It was like quite a few other ones as well that they were working on with the state and local child welfare agencies. I'm not going to lie, the other ones were a lot more boring. But
my one was the best.
obviously. But they were also, like they were also really impactful. They were all basically supporting these vulnerable families and like enabling states to support these vulnerable families. But most of the time they were not like, they were more about navigating services that existed, not so much about, providing a service in and of themselves. So maybe it was like a bit slightly less of an interesting problem as a result, I guess. But that being said, like I think for me personally, it was a difficult trend. It was a good transition at the very beginning because it was just I could finally sort of like breathe. Like it was very much, first of all, within my comfort zone of like doing the product management type stuff and like a quasi public sector environment. Like I knew exactly what to do, after being like in such an ambiguous environment for so long. And then on top of that, it was like it was pretty much a 9 to 5 after working like 16-hour days for so long. And I also had a team, so that was really exciting. Like I could actually, rely on other people to do things that were paid, and like all of these things you take for granted if you haven't done the founder journey. And then, but then eventually, I think I got to the point that I was getting bored, basically, where I felt like the product had pretty much been integrated into the current user whatever offerings. Also, that to be honest, the product was probably not their first priority. Like Debbie was not their priority. It was like the other products were much more their money makers. And so it just felt like, okay, also my passion project is not even the thing I'm necessarily spending the most time on, or that I'm spending the most of my effort on. So it felt like the right time to leave. Of course, I also had like a minimum time that I had to stay there. But yeah, basically, like I stayed about 18 months, and then I decided that I wanted to go, and I wanted to get into the climate side. I wanted a new challenge, and I thought that, especially because from the research I had done in climate tech, I didn't feel like with my background, where it was mostly software, mostly product like design, I didn't even really see myself as a commercial person at the time. I thought that I wouldn't be that useful in like a climate tech startup, I thought I would need to be like an engineer, someone like a scientist, like someone like a bit more with some harder skills, basically. And so I thought maybe I'd be more useful on the investor side, kind of having gone through the whole raise process and all of that myself. So yeah, then I joined Carbon 13 because they were recruiting for someone to start their venture launchpad program, which is an accelerator. And so I was like, I did like 5 accelerators. That was the most accelerated startup. I know exactly what was useful and what was mostly not usable, you know? And so I was like, oh, this is like a chance to actually apply what I learned, but also like learn the climate tech space, work with a bunch of founders, do like the sort of quasi investing work. And I joined Carbon 13 and it was really the right decision for me.
Yeah, how has that experience been from switching from that founder role to obviously then working at a larger company and then on the investment side? Because I think we see a lot, right? A lot of people want to get into the investment side because they kind of glorify it in different ways. How has it been sitting a bit on the side of the table for you?
Getting to the investment side, because I was starting an accelerator, I think it was, first of all, it was more entrepreneurial because I was pretty much left to my own devices to just like start this thing from scratch. So that was quite exciting, was feeling like I really had so much autonomy to create that and do what I wanted to do and use the company resources basically to make it happen. So at first it was quite like, it was a little bit, I was like, really, no one is going to give me any more guidance than this. And I was like, okay, whatever, this is what I'm used to. So it was actually like really in that way, quite comfortable for me to be able to do that. And it felt quite entrepreneurial. Eventually in terms of, and then in terms of the actual investment analysis and like that whole process, I thought that was really interesting because I think many founders will empathize with this. You know, often the strategic, more intellectually stimulating side is like 10% of what you do. Like 90% is like, this person won't respond to my email, or like, I'm setting up some CRM or something boring, you know, like most of the problems you're solving are like unsexy problems. And even like, I remember on Devi, like very specifically, like the 10% of my job that I really enjoyed was either like the strategy stuff around like, you know, market analysis, that sort of thing, or it was like the product stuff where I was really, really deep in with the customers. And I remember at some point an investor told me like, you're going to need to hire a head of products because you need to be on like the external side, basically everything I hated doing. He was like, you have to do more of that and hire someone to take away the only part of your job you like
This is why I did well, me and Gergo, I was CEO, then he was Wilco CEOs and all those different things. It's like, you be CEO and do all the meetings, I should fund stuff.
Exactly. So basically someone was telling me, you be CEO and do all the meetings and like everyone else will do all the fun stuff because they're supposedly better at that stuff. And I'm like, fine, I guess. But you know, it was not the stuff that was really energizing for me. And so I do really like that as an investor, like you're pretty much exclusively working on the fun stuff. Like you basically I get to learn so much about, the other thing that I think like was maybe something I didn't expect. So after working in innovation and government for so long, I had been working on so many different problem statements. You know, like I worked with the veterans, I worked with free school lunches, I worked in Madagascar with nutrition, you know, like completely different stuff. And I loved that level of variety. And 3 years of just working on early childhood development and parenting, I was like, oh my God, I've become the parenting lady. Like, yeah. I'm kind of over this, like just thinking about one problem all the time, even. And so actually going back to having that level of variety and having that level of stimulation, I thought was really, really energizing and refreshing after coming out of that like founder space of being like really in the operations. Eventually, though, of course, you know, like you get the itch of like, okay, but, you know, I can't actually do anything. Basically, I'm just, you know, you're moving money around. And of course, you're like giving some advice and like enabling. You know, it can be argued that, of course, like you're actually making more impact by being an investor or running one of these programs because you're having like such a broad impact across many, you know. But for me personally, I think I still have like quite an action oriented sort of like operator itch in me. And so I really felt like I feel like I need to have the direct impact, even if macro level, it's not as impactful as if I had a little impact on many, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, I still think that actually right now I might even have the best of both worlds where like I get to do the Carbon 13 stuff most of the time and I get the really stimulating, interesting work, but I get to work on my startup on the side as well and actually, you know, solve the problems and do the operational work as well. And so right now I feel like I have the perfect balance, but I think that it was both really energizing, but also, I guess less satisfying because, you didn't have the action part of it.
So did we all get into your new startup as well? So as you said, you're on 5 accelerators. You're also running the accelerator program for Com13. Now, there's a lot of accelerators in the UK, and some of them are good, and some of them are not so good.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a founder who's being courted, or you think, okay, I'm going to go to apply to, trying not to name anything by accident here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, if you go, this year, not that one. How can founders tell which accelerators they should be applying for that are worth their time? Are there any things that you would kind of advise them on there of like, look for programs that have this or have that? Or is it just sometimes you just don't know until you get on it?
I think a huge part is the network. So first of all, I think the fewer Zoom programs you have to attend, probably the better. Like I'd say the best accelerators that I've done have been the ones where there basically is a person who's your sort of guide to all things in that place. And they're providing really, really deep support and basically pulling in other resources as necessary. And so I feel like the closer you are to that model, like generally the closer you are to a good accelerator, because it's effectively like a good advisor, but with a lot more resources, as opposed to, oh my God, I have to sit through another like MBA 101, but worse like session. And it's literally like the tax you pay for getting what tiny amount of money they're giving you is literally how I felt about most of these things. There was one program that there was one program that I can't even remember what it was called now, that I thought was actually quite good. Even though they made us sit in these sessions and stuff, they were with like world-class people. They had like the Stanford professor talking about like product market fit, and like they really got like the best of the best from each place. And so in that case, I was like, okay, fine, it's maybe worth it. But most of the time, I think it's like inversely proportional with the number of sessions you have to attend. And then I think the other thing to look at is like the network of those people and like how many actual connections like that they're actually facilitating. And then finally, like who is going to be that point person? You almost like, there are a lot of like these career accelerator managers that have actually never done it themselves, like are not founders, like they're basically just program managers. I think like just look for the person and just see like, would you want to work with that person all the time? Do you think that they would really come up with something really of high quality? That's kind of like also a filter.
So it's actually quite hard to talk about this without accidentally throwing shade on people, isn't it? Because like I'm thinking about like I shouldn't say that because that person will know. So it's interesting, but I think like you said with the session, so we've worked our mentorship program right now, right? It's our way of testing out and accelerating in some ways. So we're doing different things and getting that feedback to then work out how to make it better for next time. And we intentionally didn't call it an accelerator because we know there's so many accelerators out there that aren't living up to the hype. So let's call it a mentorship program. Let's give you a mentor one-to-one who's aligned with you in your industry. And then we tried out workshops. Okay, people aren't attending all the workshops. Why they're not attending? Is it not good? Is it actually the time? And what is it? And I think it's kind of looking at it as a startup, right? You said, where we're trying to figure out what is it that's valuable to these people and focus on that and have experiments and take the feedback. And one of the funny things, sometimes you get the feedback and you implement it. And between the cohorts, so we said last time, they all wanted a group where they could chat. And they made a group for people to chat in this cohort, and none of them chatted. I was like,
exactly. Everyone said that. Everyone says that. They're like, oh, I want to connect with the cohort more.
Yeah. And then none of them ever tried. It was like, oh, we did it. But
it's like, watch what people do, not what they say, right? Always.
Yeah. But obviously, while running the accelerator, you came up with your own idea that building as well, like currently on the side, but go where it's going to go. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was at Carbon 13. We did a cohort. Our second cohort of the Launchpad was built environment focused. And don't get me wrong, like everything was super interesting. It just happened to be that I was doing all these interviews, like hundreds of interviews with startups that were, applying to the built environment accelerator. And I just noticed this gap where I was like, okay, everyone is telling me about analysis, software, like planning, but what about actually doing them? And then when I spoke to people in the industry, I found that actually they really didn't have any plans of doing any of these projects. And I thought that was super interesting. I was like, okay, why, like, what are they planning for then? Why are they even buying this software if they're not planning on doing anything? And part of it is compliance. Part of it is like just signaling, I suppose. And part of it is just kicking the can, right? They're like, eventually we will do it. And so but what I really found was that it came down to like financial viability. So I've learned so much about real estate finance, since starting this. But basically, it came down to financial viability. Like when they're structuring these portfolios, they need to give a certain yield. That means they literally can't spend above a certain amount of capex, which means that you literally like cannot do most of these energy efficiency upgrades that should be done. And it seems like a win-win, right? It's a relatively cheap, de-risked technology. It's like, it's going to save you money. It's actually not. In this case, it's like because there's a tenant and landlord split between the person who actually owns the building and who's in it. The tenant gets the benefit, not the landlords. Actually, there is not as much as an easy win-win because you don't get necessarily the energy savings. And then like it's also being done in a relatively shrinking market. So we were particularly looking at commercial real estate and retrofit. And, after COVID, people are mostly not using offices in the same way that they were. And so the valuations have come down really far. And, there's even less appetite to invest on top of that than there was at any probably other point. And so there's so many of these systemic reasons, and yet everyone is like, oh, I'm offering you like this deep retrofit plan. And it's like just felt so wildly out of touch with reality when I actually spoke to these funds that I was like, okay, this seems interesting. I want to try that. And at first I just had this I had a few simple ideas, what I thought were simple ideas. And like, and at first they were like working relatively well. Literally none of them have lasted. None of them, not a single one. So one was that, okay, what if you just corrected the landlord-tenant misalignment? So you just basically took some of the savings that the tenant achieved because the landlord invested and returned them back to the landlord so that they would still get a payback period, but over a longer period of time, potentially. I literally labored under that assumption for like a long time trying to make that work, but it was crazy difficult. So one was like every time we go to a building, like let's say you get one landlord on board, they own 100 buildings. Each of those 100 buildings has like 10 tenants. You now have to convince all of those 10 tenants to pay you a portion of their energy savings in order to even start on a project. So it just made our go-to-market process so much longer that even though it felt like it was a no-brainer, it was just like impossible. Like it moved our CAC like crazy. Then I think that was one like very closely held thing I had to give away. Then the other was that, okay, if you get enough scale of these projects, you can reduce the cost a lot. So let's say instead of doing like it was like weird to me that like, why are they doing a deep retrofit on a single building when they could just take one technology and just wrap it across a bunch of them? And then that would, in theory, be like a much more efficient way of rolling these things out, and you could bring the cost down too. Also, crazy difficult. Like that's not the way the installation market works. And that's not the way they like procure this kind of technology. And it's seen as like actually inefficient because you're disrupting tenants many times rather than just once. So and they're aiming for a specific EPC level. They're not just aiming to get technologies in as cheap as possible, So it just like so many things that felt like such a no-brainer. Like, why aren't they doing it this way? Of course, like over the course of actually trying to do this, you learn that there is a way. And I think to be fair, I think we still are doing it much more efficiently, and we are still like using nuggets of some of those initial ideas, but the initial ideas are completely gone. And I think one of the other things that I wanted to do at the very beginning was around like the financing. So we wanted to like, it wasn't even I really thought that we wanted to work with SME landlords. So the ones that owned like maybe 5-10 buildings at most, and were mostly occupied by other SMEs, and that those were the ones that were really I assumed like the big guys would basically fund it themselves eventually and make it happen, but these were the ones that would be left behind. I thought that was the gap in the market. And what we found was like we went through this whole process. We figured out all the interventions that needed to be done. At the time, we even had that tenant thing. So we convinced all the tenants to actually pay us a portion of their bills and everything. And then we tried to get the landlord, went to the bank to get like a loan for the actual amount to cover the upfront costs. And the rate he got was like 15% because it was seen as like asset financing, basically, like SME asset financing, not project financing. And so that was like, okay, the project died at that point because like the cost of financing was just too high and they didn't have like that kind of cash lying around, basically. And so just like at every step, there's like something new. And now actually we've transitioned where, so at first we made a pivot to like actually work with like the large asset owners and investors. Now we're at the point where we realize that's like a really difficult to scale model because operationally it's so difficult to, like I said, for the reasons I mentioned, like the installation stuff is really difficult, whatever, like it's not very efficient, basically. And so now we're really focused on the financing gap. So we're almost back to like a problem we encountered at the very beginning where we're like, what if we actually just came back to that? And like, how would we solve that? And now we're focusing on unlocking project financing for retrofit. So it's like just been so many iterations of that idea. But the initial kernel came from Carbon 13, where I was like, okay, so many companies are pitching me this analysis, but none of them are happening. And that problem hasn't changed, actually.
So we come towards the end of the podcast now as well. What I want to get from you is, because you've done so many different things, right? What are the things that make you most proud? What are you most happy about from your career and like all the stuff you've done so far?
I mean, I think, of course, one of my proudest accomplishments is probably scaling Devi. I think that was really, it's probably something that will have impact on these parents and on these children, and it's something that I'm really proud of. And I think it's like finally actually reaching the families that were Laura and I's vision to actually serve in the first place. And of course, like over time, that gets diluted, and then we came back to it, which is really exciting. I think that was the first one. Second accomplishment, oh my God, I don't even know if I have that many accomplishments to talk about. I think probably my second one was probably in high school. I did an Arangetram. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a big dance performance. Yes, exactly. So I learned Indian classical, Carnatic music and Bharatanatyam, basically my whole life. I love the
swerve there from like, let's go Devi, and then...
But this was genuinely this was genuinely nearly as hard. But basically like, so I did this like 2.5 hours solo dance performance that I prepared for like well over a year. And like, I'm not one of these people that like physical grace and coordination comes naturally to me. So I just felt like, most of the time, especially, academically, like not to like feel snobbish or anything, but I don't have to work that hard to be good at school or to be good at like most of those sort of like bookish type things. I think my instincts are reasonably good, but doing something physical like that, it's like the opposite. I have zero instinct. I have like no natural ability. And actually being able
to... need a ball now to throw it to see.
It would hit my face. It would hit my face. Like I have no reflexes. Like, like I am known as being an uncoordinated person. And like to then do like a 2.5 hour, quite intricate, like dance performance was just like really, really difficult for me. Like it did not come naturally at all. But I think genuinely to this day, it's probably the thing I worked hardest at. And so, and still like, performed and did well. So I think that's probably my second proudest accomplishment. And honestly, I don't think I have a third. I think those are my two.
But it's also interesting because like, I think a lot of people forget is that when you do something like, so for example, I was a Bhangra dancer, right? So I did competitions, all that stuff, right? That's actually how I know my co-founders, because me and his wife, he's been the same team.
Oh, so cool.
Doing those things like that and training hard for competitions and things, it translates in terms of the discipline, the resilience, the mindset, and those skills can go across. And sometimes people forget that, right? They think, I've never started a company before. Because like, what have you done that's really hard in your past and trained really hard for it and then been able to achieve it? And if you can get into that mindset, you can transfer it across.
Exactly.
But we're looking at, so what we're doing now is that, so over 200 episodes in, and we're getting people on 200 episodes later, so it'll be in 2 years' time. And what I want to sit here is like, in 2 years' time, what would you love to be able to sit here and say has been your proudest accomplishment of the last 2 years?
I mean, I hope it's that I've scaled Upgrade and that we've actually got a financing product in the market that is financing retrofits for small and medium sized landlords. So basically that own under 10 million pounds worth of property. We're aiming to be able to retrofit 500 to 1,000 buildings a year, or finance the retrofit of 500 to 1,000 buildings a year. So I think that's going to be I hope we're at that stage by the time I come back.
So actually this morning, somebody who was episode 4 came on, and what I got them to do is listen to the episode from originally.
Oh my God, that will be so
and compare. And so it's like, what you got to do now is, if someone in 2 years' time, is listen back to what you've just said, and then we can see, like, is that where you're at, or what happened, or what pivoted, and what?
Yeah, exactly. What iteration are we on now? It's probably completely not a financial product anymore, but let's see.
And then, like, longer term, right? So where do you hope one day that you can get Upgreen to?
I mean, I hope that we're actually financing this stuff at scale, right? 500 to 1,000 buildings is barely making a dent in the problem. I mean, I think, to some extent we have a bit of a timeline, 5 years, 10 years is really the max that we can be waiting to do a lot of this work. So I think hopefully we're working with many more banks. So for example, my assumption right now is that for each bank, we'll be looking at 500 to 1,000 a year. But ideally, we're working with like 50 to 60 banks. And therefore we have, 50,000 buildings that we're actually doing per year. I think that would be, for me, that would be success. Or, we've actually been acquired or integrated into either a really large asset managers, someone like Blackstone or something, where like they have a massive number of buildings that we can just roll this out into, or like a bank that has a massive commercial mortgage portfolio or like a large commercial real estate portfolio, and they're able to roll that into that. So I think like anything that will help us get to that carbon mitigation faster, because there's a time value to the carbon that we're mitigating, will be the dream for me with Upgreen.
Okay, so we're going to move on to quick 5 questions now. So first one is, who are 3 Asian heritage or British Asians in the UK that you think are doing incredible work and love to shout them out?
Amazing. So there's Dhruv and Preeti. They are working on ends and walls. They're basically working on decarbonizing the built environment. They have a much more efficient heating, cooling, and air filtration system that they're working on that's retrofittable, especially in the places where heat pumps aren't suitable. So I think they're working on incredible things. They've just raised a big round. I mean, their doggedness and what's the word? Just like determination is really, really impressive. The other is Drita. She's running Samudra Oceans. They do robotics for ocean farming, specifically seaweed farming. Again, I just think someone who's so incredibly determined, so resourceful, also literally always has time for like a text to make sure that you're okay somehow also. I mean, she's just like an incredible founder. And I think this is her second or third company. She's been around. She's very accomplished and experienced with this. And then the last one is Shruti. She is at Mani AI. They are working on basically using AI for factory optimization, and automation, but enabling them to basically do on-demand manufacturing for textiles and fashion. So at the moment, basically people vastly overproduce the amount of textiles that they should be, because they can't like forecast it accurately, but also it's just not economical to do smaller batches. But in their case, because they're automating all of these different parts of the factory process using AI and optimizing it, they're enabling them to actually do this on-demand manufacturing and enabling them to reduce a lot of the textile and clothing waste that's going to landfill currently.
Awesome. So like 4 great founders there.
Yes, 2 of them are a team, but yes, and they are both South Asian.
Yeah, I always say 3, and people always kind of like, well, the co-founders, it's fine.
Sorry.
I let people get away with it. Don't worry.
I'll give it to Drew. I can't choose. I can't choose favorites.
So, and if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to, Upgreen, and your work Carbon 13 as well, where do they go to?
They can go to my LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest place to reach me, but you can also reach me at puja@getupgreen.com.
And is there anything that you need help with right now that maybe the audience listening could help you with?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we're looking to connect with engineering firms that actually implement retrofits. So actually I won't even say just engineering firms. I'm saying if anyone does building upgrades or retrofit upgrades, or actually implements these projects, we are trying to get data partnerships with them, because we literally cannot keep. We are implementing projects, of course, as well. But the speed at which we need to build that data set of projects to be able to build the financial product, like, we will never keep up with. So we're trying to partner to basically capture some of that data and work with them in a really synergetic way to bring the financing to market that will enable them to do more projects as well. That's one. The other is, of course, if you know of property investors or asset managers that are looking to improve the EPC levels or the energy efficiency of their building stock, then put them in touch. We're also trying to connect with banks at the moment. So anyone who's doing this green financing and can potentially partner with us on the project financing proposition is someone we're looking to speak to.
Awesome. And then, been so great to have you on and hear your story. Have you got any final words?
Final words, thanks for having me. It's been great reflecting.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.